The Eastern Interconnection had been operating for 73 years without a major cascade failure. It was the largest synchronized power grid on the planet, spanning from Montana to Florida, delivering electricity to more than 220 million people across 39 states and 8 Canadian provinces. Every second of every day, hundreds of utility companies fed power into this vast network, balanced by automated systems that monitored voltage, frequency, and load distribution in real time. The grid's stability depended on split-second coordination between thousands of sensors, controllers, and relay switches. Engineers called it a marvel of distributed architecture. What they didn't know was that for 6 months the sensors had been lying. The attack didn't begin with explosions or blackouts. It began with data, specifically with SCADA systems, supervisory control and data acquisition networks that regulated everything from turbine speeds to voltage levels across substations. These systems collected measurements from field devices every 4 seconds, aggregating millions of data points into control dashboards that grid operators used to make decisions. If a sensor reported high voltage at one substation, operators could reroute power to prevent equipment damage. If frequency dropped below 60 Hz, automatic controls would activate backup generators to stabilize the grid. The entire system relied on one fundamental assumption: that the sensors were telling the truth. They weren't. In January, a firmware update was deployed across 847 intelligent electronic devices manufactured by a single vendor. The update was signed with valid certificates delivered through trusted channels and installed during routine maintenance windows. Nothing appeared unusual. The devices continued reporting measurements, logging events, and responding to operator commands exactly as expected. But beneath the surface, a modification had been embedded into the firmware's core logic. Every reading transmitted by these devices was now being filtered through an algorithm designed to introduce drift, small, imperceptible errors that would accumulate over time. The drift was extraordinary in its subtlety. Voltage readings were shifted by 0.3%. Frequency measurements were delayed by 80 milliseconds. Load calculations were adjusted by margins too small to trigger alarms. Individual operators reviewing their local systems saw nothing wrong. Regional coordination centers saw normal traffic patterns. The independent system operator responsible for balancing supply and demand across the entire Eastern Interconnection detected no anomaly. Every dashboard, every alert system, every predictive model was being fed corrupted data, and none of them knew it. By March, the drift had created a phantom grid. The real Eastern Interconnection was experiencing voltage sags in Pennsylvania, frequency instability in Virginia, and load imbalances across the Midwest. But the control systems believed everything was stable. Operators made decisions based on false readings, rerouting power to address problems that didn't exist while ignoring real issues they couldn't see. Protective relays, devices designed to disconnect equipment during dangerous conditions, were receiving manipulated inputs that kept them from activating. The grid was drifting out of sync with itself, one measurement at a time. The scale of the compromise was staggering. 847 devices across 200 substations in 14 states. Utilities in Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, Virginia, Maryland, and New Jersey were affected. So were portions of Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Michigan, Tennessee, West Virginia, Wisconsin, and North Carolina. These weren't small rural substations. They were critical junction points where high-voltage transmission lines converged, where power from coal plants, nuclear facilities, wind farms, and hydroelectric dams was aggregated and distributed. If these nodes failed in sequence, the cascade would be unstoppable. What made the attack so effective was its patience. Most cyber attacks are designed for immediate impact. Ransomware locks systems and demands payment. Distributed denial-of-service attacks flood networks with traffic until they collapse. Wiper malware destroys data and shuts down infrastructure. These attacks are loud, visible, and traceable. The SCADA manipulation was different. It didn't destroy anything. It didn't demand anything. It simply waited, allowing the grid to drift further from stability every day while operators made decisions based on increasingly unreliable information. By April, the real grid and the phantom grid had diverged by nearly 4%. This was still below the threshold that would trigger automatic alarms, but it was approaching a critical boundary. Engineers who design power grids build in safety margins to account for unexpected surges, equipment failures, and weather events. These margins are calculated assuming that sensor data is accurate. If the data is wrong, the margins disappear. A grid operating at what it believes 96% capacity might actually be at 103%, exceeding design limits, straining transformers, and edging toward instability. The first sign of trouble appeared on April 18th at 2:47 p.m. Eastern Time. A transmission line in southwestern Pennsylvania tripped offline due to what operators believed was a routine equipment fault. Standard protocol required rerouting power through adjacent lines to maintain supply. The control systems calculated the optimal redistribution based on current load data and executed the reroute automatically. But the load data was wrong. The adjacent lines were already carrying more power than the sensors reported. When the additional load was transferred, 3 lines exceeded their thermal limits simultaneously. Protective relays should have disconnected the overloaded lines immediately. They didn't. The relays were receiving false temperature readings that indicated safe operating conditions. The lines continued carrying excessive current, heating beyond design specifications. At 2:51 p.m., the first line sagged low enough to contact tree branches and short-circuited. At 2:52 p.m., the second line failed. At 2:53 p.m., the third line dropped offline. Within 6 minutes, 1,800 megawatts of power that had been flowing through Pennsylvania was suddenly rerouted through lines in Ohio and West Virginia. Those lines, already stressed by the hidden load imbalance, began overheating immediately. The cascade was beginning. Grid operators across the region saw their dashboards light up with alerts, but the alerts didn't make sense. Systems reported line failures in Pennsylvania, but voltage readings indicated stable conditions. Frequency measurements showed no disturbances, even as power flows shifted dramatically. Some operators assumed the alerts were false positives, software glitches that would resolve themselves. Others began manually checking substations, trying to reconcile what their screens were showing with reports from field crews. No one realized the sensors were compromised. At 3:04 p.m., a coordination center in Ohio detected something unusual. An engineer reviewing historical data noticed that frequency measurements from certain substations hadn't varied in 46 minutes. An impossibility in a dynamic power grid where frequency fluctuates constantly. He flagged the anomaly to his supervisor, who contacted the device manufacturer. By 3:17 p.m., 3 separate utilities had reported similar patterns. Sensors returning perfectly stable readings even as equipment behavior suggested otherwise. At 3:29 p.m., a security analyst at the manufacturer identified the firmware version installed across the affected devices. She compared it against the cryptographic signature of the official release and found a match. The firmware was authentic. But when she examined the binary code itself, she discovered a discrepancy. 4,700 lines of undocumented logic embedded in the telemetry processing module. She escalated immediately. By 3:45 p.m., the Department of Energy's Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response Office had been notified. By 4:02 p.m., the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency had activated its incident response protocols. By 4:18 p.m., NSA had been briefed on the scope of the compromise. The picture was catastrophic. 847 devices across 14 states were transmitting corrupted data. The real grid conditions were unknown. Operators were flying blind, making decisions based on false readings while the Eastern Interconnection drifted further out of sync. And the cascade that had begun in Pennsylvania was still propagating through the network. At 4:31 p.m., NSA analysts identified the attack's objective. The firmware modification wasn't just introducing random errors. It was designed to push the grid toward a specific failure mode, a cascading collapse triggered by simultaneous overloads at critical substations. The algorithm had been carefully calibrated to avoid detection while steering the grid toward instability. If the Pennsylvania line failures had occurred 30 minutes later, when evening demand spiked across the Northeast, the cascade would have been unstoppable. 73 million homes would have lost power within 17 minutes. The economic cost would have exceeded $40 billion in the first week alone. Hospitals, data centers, water treatment facilities, and transportation systems across 15 states would have shut down. Food supplies and refrigerated warehouses would have spoiled. Traffic signals in 200 cities would have gone dark. Telecommunications networks, dependent on battery backups designed for short outages, would have failed within hours. The recovery would have taken weeks. It came that close. At 4:47 p.m., emergency orders were issued to manually disconnect all compromised devices from the SCADA network. For the first time in the Eastern Interconnection's history, operators would have to manage the grid without real-time sensor data from critical substations. Backup systems were activated. Manual readings were collected from field crews. Engineers calculated load distributions using decades-old methods, cross-referencing historical data and weather forecasts to estimate demand patterns. At 5:03 p.m., NSA deployed countermeasures to neutralize the remaining threat. The details remain classified, but the results were immediate. The corrupted firmware stopped transmitting false data. Devices began reporting accurate readings again. Within 19 minutes, operators regained visibility into the true state of the grid. It was worse than anyone had realized. Voltage imbalances existed across 6 states. Frequency deviations were approaching critical thresholds in 3 regions. Load distributions were 8% off from what control systems had believed. The grid wasn't just drifting. It was on the edge of a synchronized collapse that would have affected every state east of the Rocky Mountains. Emergency load shedding began at 5:22 p.m. Non-critical industrial customers were disconnected first, reducing demand by 3,400 megawatts. Interruptible power contracts were activated, cutting another 1,800 megawatts. Voltage set points were manually adjusted at 127 substations to stabilize frequency. Backup generators at 17 power plants were brought online ahead of schedule to provide additional capacity. By 6:15 p.m., the grid had been pulled back from the brink. Frequency stabilized at 5997 Hz. Voltage imbalances corrected. Load distributions returned to safe levels. The cascade that had begun in Pennsylvania was contained, but the vulnerability remained. Over the following 72 hours, every intelligent electronic device manufactured by the compromised vendor was inspected, re-imaged, and verified. Utilities across the Eastern Interconnection implemented enhanced monitoring protocols to detect future sensor manipulation. Federal agencies launched investigations to determine how the malicious firmware had been signed with valid certificates and distributed through trusted channels. The answers were unsettling. The attack had been in development for more than 18 months. The firmware modification had been inserted at the manufacturing level, embedded in devices before they shipped to utilities. The signing certificates were legitimate. They belonged to the manufacturer's internal systems, which had been compromised through a separate intrusion months earlier. The attackers had positioned themselves inside the supply chain, waiting for the right moment to trigger the cascade. No utility had been breached directly. No operator had clicked a malicious link or downloaded infected software. The compromise had occurred before the devices ever reached their destination. This was supply chain interdiction at industrial scale. In the weeks following the incident, 39 states reviewed their critical infrastructure dependencies. 8 federal agencies coordinated the largest supply chain security audit in history. International partners in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia reported similar firmware anomalies in their power systems. None had progressed as far as the Eastern Interconnection compromise, but all shared the same underlying vulnerability. The forensic investigation revealed details that made the attack even more disturbing. Analysts examining the compromised firmware discovered that it contained not just one payload, but three. The first layer, the sensor manipulation code that had been detected, was designed to be found. It was sophisticated enough to cause real damage, but obvious enough that determined investigators would eventually identify it. The second layer was a persistence mechanism designed to survive firmware updates and re-imaging procedures by hiding in protected memory regions of the device's chipset. The third layer was never activated. It remained dormant, waiting for a trigger signal that never came. What would that third layer have done? NSA analysts spent 11 days reverse engineering the code. The answer was chilling. The third payload was designed to permanently brick the devices, to overwrite their firmware with corrupted data that would render them inoperable. If activated during the cascade failure, it would have destroyed 847 critical sensors across the Eastern Interconnection simultaneously, leaving operators blind in the middle of the largest power outage in American history. Recovery wouldn't have taken weeks, it would have taken months. The sophistication of the attack suggested a level of operational planning rarely seen in cyber operations. Whoever designed this intrusion understood not just computer systems, but power grid engineering, supply chain logistics, and crisis response procedures. They knew how utilities would react to sensor failures. They knew how long it would take to replace 847 devices. They knew that destroying monitoring infrastructure during a cascade would transform a recoverable incident into a prolonged catastrophe. This wasn't the work of criminal hackers or opportunistic ransomware operators. This was nation-state-level capability deployed with strategic patience and precise timing. The attribution analysis took 6 weeks. Intelligence agencies examined server infrastructure, code signatures, operational patterns, and targeting priorities. They tracked the intrusion back through 3 continents and 17 proxy networks before identifying indicators that pointed to a sophisticated adversary with known capabilities in supply chain interdiction and critical infrastructure targeting. The details of that attribution remain classified, but senior officials who were briefed on the findings described it as one of the most alarming intelligence assessments they had encountered. The attack on the Eastern Grid wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a broader campaign. In the months following the Pennsylvania line failures, similar compromises were discovered in water treatment systems in the Pacific Northwest, natural gas pipeline controls in the Southwest, and telecommunications infrastructure across the Midwest. None had progressed as far as the power grid attack, but all shared the same methodology: supply chain insertion, patient positioning, and hidden payloads waiting for activation. The conclusion was inescapable. Critical infrastructure across multiple sectors had been pre-positioned for disruption. The strategic implications were profound. In a conventional conflict, military forces target power plants, communication hubs, and transportation networks to degrade an adversary's ability to sustain operations. But such attacks are visible, attributable, and provide clear justification for military response. What had been discovered in the Eastern Grid was different, a form of pre-conflict positioning that could achieve the same disruptive effects without firing a shot, without crossing borders, and without providing clear evidence of attack until the damage was already done. This was the cyber equivalent of sleeper cells embedded in critical infrastructure, waiting for orders to activate. The defensive response required coordination across 16 federal agencies and thousands of private sector entities. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency established new protocols for supply chain verification. The Department of Energy mandated enhanced monitoring requirements for all grid operators. The FBI launched investigations into every manufacturer whose devices were deployed in critical infrastructure. The National Security Council convened a series of classified briefings to assess the full scope of national vulnerability. But the most significant change occurred at the operational level. where grid engineers and security analysts began working together in ways they never had before. Traditionally, power grid operations focused on electrical engineering, voltage, frequency, load balancing. Cybersecurity was treated as an IT function, separate from the physical operation of the grid. The Eastern Grid incident shattered that separation. Engineers could no longer assume their sensors were telling the truth. Security analysts could no longer focus solely on network intrusions. The line between physical infrastructure and digital systems had disappeared. New training programs were developed to teach grid operators how to detect sensor manipulation. Red team exercises were conducted where security professionals attempted to compromise SCADA systems while operators tried to maintain grid stability using manual procedures. Joint operations centers were established where engineers and cyber analysts monitored the grid together, cross-validating sensor data against physical observations and historical patterns. It was a fundamental shift in how critical infrastructure was defended, not as separate layers of physical security and cybersecurity, but as an integrated system where every digital input was treated as potentially compromised until verified through multiple independent sources. The public was never told. Government officials debated disclosure for 17 days before deciding that revealing the full scope of the attack would undermine confidence in critical infrastructure without providing actionable information for citizens. A limited statement was released acknowledging cybersecurity enhancements to power grid monitoring systems, but no details about the near miss were shared. News coverage was minimal. Within 3 weeks, the story had faded from public attention, but among the engineers, analysts, and officials who understood what had almost happened, the incident became a defining moment. They had witnessed how close modern society had come to a collapse that would have affected every aspect of daily life, from the lights in homes to the refrigeration of food, from hospital life support systems to the data centers that powered the internet. And they understood that the capability to trigger such a collapse hadn't been destroyed. It had merely been discovered and temporarily disrupted. The adversary was still out there, and they were learning from their mistakes. But inside the national security apparatus, the incident became a reference point for a new category of threat: invisible, patient, supply chain embedded attacks designed to position adversaries for strategic disruption without triggering immediate alarms. Unlike traditional cyber attacks that sought immediate chaos, this approach prioritized persistence and precision. The goal wasn't to destroy infrastructure. It was to compromise it so thoroughly that when the moment came, collapse would be inevitable. The Eastern Grid incident proved that moment had almost arrived. Engineers who studied the attack identified 23 decision points where intervention could have prevented the cascade. 19 of those points were missed because operators trusted their sensors. 3 were missed because the alerts seemed inconsistent with other data. 1 was missed because the engineer who noticed the anomaly was overruled by a supervisor who believed it was a false positive. That's how close it was. 1 decision, 1 ignored warning, 1 moment of doubt. Today, the Eastern Interconnection operates with enhanced redundancy. Sensor data is cross-validated against multiple sources before being used for critical decisions. Firmware updates are subjected to cryptographic verification and behavioral analysis before deployment. Utilities conduct regular exercises simulating sensor compromise scenarios to ensure operators can manage the grid manually if automation fails. But the fundamental architecture hasn't changed. The grid still depends on thousands of sensors feeding data into centralized control systems. The supply chain still involves manufacturers, distributors, and installers spread across multiple countries. The attack surface still exists, and somewhere the capability that nearly brought down the Eastern Interconnection in 17 minutes is being refined for the next attempt. The devices have been cleaned. The firmware has been verified. The vulnerabilities have been patched, but the sensors are still there. And every 4 seconds they report measurements that operators trust to keep 220 million people powered. Every 4 seconds, the grid makes decisions based on what the sensors say. And every 4 seconds, someone is watching to see if the sensors can be made to lie again.